Welcome to FinScale, a podcast created by Solen Niederkorn, shedding light on innovation in finance, banking, and insurance.
Past, present, and future of money. Ronit Ghose, Global Head, Future of Finance at Citi.
There's a famous quote from, I think it's William Gibson, that says, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And the future, in many ways, is already here when it comes to, say, the use of extended reality or immersive metaverse-like experiences, or just living in a digital world. And I always say the future is unevenly distributed by demographics and age and preferences.
I'm excited to speak with Ronit this week. He has a talent for simplifying finance from a macro perspective and can think conceptually about the industry's future. Recently, this brilliant mind from Citi published a new book on the industry's future. He presents a comprehensive overview of money throughout history, spanning from ancient times to the present day and beyond. This episode provides us with a great opportunity to gain perspective and focus on some incredible aspects that tech in finance enables, such as promoting greater inclusion and providing access to banking services for women. These use cases demonstrate that change is indeed underway and is accelerating. I share Ronit's passion for discussing the future, so I'll let you enjoy this beautiful retrospective guided by his book. Enjoy the show! Hello, everyone. Hi, Ronit.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on the podcast. I'm really happy to have this special edition about money, past, present, future of money with you, Ronit. It's following a book that you recently published and many other topics that you will share with us that concerns also your incredible career in the financial services. But prior to that, could you please introduce yourself to the audience of the FinScale podcast?
Sure. As you said, I've just published a book called Future Money, Fintech, AI, and Web3. This was published in the UK and around the world in early March, and in the US and Canada at the end of March, early April. This book is about some of the big themes of the past, present, and future of financial services and money. And we illustrate that through stories of founders, entrepreneurs, policymakers, investors. And it's really a collection of stories based on my 25 plus years in financial services. I'm currently based in Dubai, where I run a global think tank for Citigroup, the bank. It's called Future of Finance. So the think tank does what the name says. It's all about the future of finance. We set that up 3 years ago. Until 3 years ago, I was the global head of banks and fintech research at Citigroup, job I'd done for about 12, 13 years. I lose track. In addition to my role or my main avatar at Citi, I have a few other avatars. I sit on the advisory board of a business school in London. I'm part of the founding team of a Web3 VC in Dubai. And I'm an advisor to other tech and emerging tech and VC companies, mainly in UK, Middle East, and Africa.
Incredible. Okay, so now if we rewind a little bit, I was interested to start with the origins of money. I've heard of it, some maybe not. So I would like you to share with us your knowledge about the way it evolved from ancient systems to the complex financial services and products that we see today around the world, and explain to us how it transitioned.
Absolutely. So money is, in economics textbooks, money is defined a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of payment. So that's the kind of formal economics definition of money, which makes it sound quite boring. It's a functional definition, and all of those three functions are true of money. But an anthropological or literary definition of money would be perhaps somewhat different. In many ways, money is something that's quite magical. It's something we as a society have decided upon. Money has value because we as a community, whichever the community happens to be, our village, our tribe, our nation state, or in the case of the euro, a collection of nation states, a community comes together and says, this has value. Now, in prehistoric times, if you and I were in a community, maybe I would do something for you that would have value. I would do a task, or I would give you some food, and then you would have a effective debt in regard to me. And then maybe after a while, you would do something for me. And it was an exchange of obligations or debts. At some point, those became tokenized into coins, because this abstract idea of I owe you a favor, I owe you a debt, got swapped into a form of coins, or actually even before coins, there were tokens like clay beads or things like that, shells. Coins start around in a formal way 2,500 years ago. It's usually dated to classical Greece, or what is Turkey today. And banknotes start somewhere between 600 and 800 AD in China. They invented printing and paper, so they invented banknotes. And fiat currency, which is banknotes not backed by gold, silver, or any assets, they start in the late 1200s. So that's the kind of backstory of money. And it's a fascinating story, and we discuss that in chapter 1 of the book. In fact, in chapter 1 of the book, let me get the book and read out the title, because let me get this right, what I actually said. So I called chapter 1 of the book, Use This Paper as Money or I Will Kill You. Use this paper as money or I will kill you. Now, where does that come from? That's a statement from Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he is, he's one of the early rulers of China, and he's the first one to use fiat money. He basically creates this concept of fiat.
It has spread around the world, but it's interesting that there are some cultural and economic differences in regions, in cities that shape local perceptions of money. You shared with me when we prepared this episode some interesting stories, but I would like you to share with us stories about Cape Town and Mumbai.
Sure. So one of the things we do in the book is we look at how money is changing, or finance is changing, in the last 10 years and 15 years. So chapter 1 of the book is very much history and prehistory. Chapters 2 to 7 of the book is how money and finance has changed in the last 15 years. And it's really been a change driven by the mobile internet. So I'm just waving my smartphone right now. Obviously, you can't see this. You're listening to audio only. But this device, the smartphone, and this generation of compute, internet-based mobile compute, has changed financial services. In a way, a lot of what we call fintechs, these companies that have emerged, they emerged really to serve the world of digitally native, mobile native clients. And they emerge in places like, Kenya, in China, in India. And they emerge in these places more than, say, necessarily in the UK or France or Luxembourg, because there isn't an established, deep infrastructure in these countries when it comes to money or payments. So there's a lot of white space or green space, a lot of empty land. And it's easier to build new things on empty land than pull down existing buildings and then build on top of the existing buildings. So the challenge, in a way, Europe has, particularly Europe, and to some extent the US as well, is that there's already a lot of buildings, and some quite functionally good buildings and sometimes very beautiful buildings. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about infrastructure here, but you could talk about its architecture, roads, anything. But the same with monetary infrastructure and financial infrastructure. It works. It largely works. And it supports an economy and a living standard that's very high. In some countries, like in the Benelux, amongst the highest in the world. So changing that can be difficult. Whereas if you're in Mumbai or Bombay, as it used to be called when I lived there as a child, or in Cape Town or in Hangzhou, you're looking for things to change, because where you've been in the last 10, 15 years isn't where you want to be. You want to be richer, you want to have a better life, you want to have a more comfortable life. And often you don't have this kind of infrastructure in place. One tangible example, we could say phones, right? Mobile phones, because money and finance in emerging markets are very much connected to the mobile phone. M-Pesa being the best example. But 20 years ago, most people in these countries didn't have a phone 20 years ago. Like if you're in India 20 years ago, or in most parts of Africa, you didn't have a phone before smartphones and before feature phones. The first generation mobile phones took off 20 years ago, or even maybe 20 years, 25 years ago. Not everyone, most people in Europe 25 years ago had a phone. In the US had a phone, right? So what happens in these parts of the world is you don't get a landline. You go straight to a mobile. You don't say, oh, I've got a landline, but I don't use it. I use the mobile. I'm mobile first, which is what most of us are. If we live in the UK, Europe, America, we're mobile first. We've got a landline somewhere, but we don't use it. In many other parts of the world, there's no landline. It's mobile only. And the internet is the same. It's mobile only. It's the same with computers. If you talk to older people in Europe and in America, you have to say mobile internet rather than desktop internet. If I'm talking to someone in their 50s, 60s, 70s, you have to say, I'm talking about the mobile internet. If you're talking to someone in China or India or Africa, you don't have to say mobile internet. Internet is mobile internet. So because there's been this big, what's called leapfrogging in technology and social behavior, a lot of new technologies or adaptation and implementation of new technologies and new business models have taken place in what we used to call emerging markets. What we used to call emerging markets, the global south, is no longer behind when it comes to new technology. When it comes to the adaptation and use of new technology, including in money and financial services, they're usually ahead. For me, maybe one last story before I hand the mic back to you. I was giving a presentation in China in 2018 at an Alibaba conference, and I came off stage. It was 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was hungry, and I went looking for food because I hadn't eaten before I spoke. And it was an Alibaba conference in Hangzhou, which is their sort of corporate town, their head office. And I couldn't buy myself any food because my MasterCard wasn't accepted anywhere. My Amex wasn't accepted anywhere. I didn't have Alipay or WeChat Pay. I couldn't buy food. So this kind of mobile payment revolution took off in China last decade, taken off in India through what's called UPI in a way that it's way, way more, you could say, in air quotes, advanced than in Europe or America.
I was interested that you share with us something that you said to me last time about Pakistan and the way fintech really enhanced financial inclusion with regard to women in particular. Could you say a few words about this?
Yeah, in the Pakistan chapter of the book, we talk a lot about what's still a huge problem. Inclusion, I mean, there's this, I know it's a cliche when founders say, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, but there's a huge problem of inclusion in many countries of the world, but particularly in places like Pakistan. So just looking for the stats. So financial penetration in Pakistan is generally low. So if you look at private credit to GDP a few years ago, this is data from 2020, so it's a couple of years old. Pakistan was only 15% private credit to GDP. The same year, Brazil was 70. If you looked at the US that year, it was over 200%. Pakistan was 15. It was way behind many emerging markets, large emerging markets. If you looked at penetration of bank accounts for the whole population in 2021, Pakistan was sub 15%. It was pretty bad. It was pretty shocking stats. And then for women, once you leave the big cities, it's even worse. There's hardly, it's outside the big cities, it's single digit penetration of bank accounts. So here are the numbers for Pakistan as per the World Bank in 2021. In 2021, in the whole country, going to the World Bank, 14% of Pakistanis had bank accounts, females, And for men, it was slightly higher. It was close to 30. It was two times. It was close to 30% in 2021. And for the same year in India, for women, it was about 76%. 70s, yeah, it was in the 70s. And the same year for men, it was exactly the same. So women and men in India had exactly the same level of ownership of bank accounts. Now, there's a different question of there's any money in the bank account, but access to a bank account, about 4 and 5 Indian men and 4 and 5 Indian women had an bank account in 2021, according to the World Bank. It was less than 1 in 3 Pakistani men and less than 1 in 6 Pakistani women. So that big gap, I mean, yes, you could say it's culture or society or religion, but actually a lot of this is technology and policy. Because if you go back to, say, 2011, in 2011, so this was only 10 years ago before the 2021 data I just read out. So in that 10 years, in 2011, the number of Indian women with a bank account was about 25%. So it went from 26% in 2011 to 76% by 2021. So in 10 years, actually by 2017, it had gone up. So it was actually in 6 years, 2011 to 2017. It was a massive increase. It was a 3x increase of women having a bank account. And it may not seem like an obviously big thing, but we in the West all have bank accounts. But imagine if you didn't have a bank account, Solen, how would you survive? What would you do?
I couldn't imagine.
Yeah, you'd have to go to,
you ask for a cash partner,
your partner or your father, or it's a huge issue. It's the same happened in Kenya when M-Pesa arrived, and the average woman in the village or in the small town, in their smartphones, not smartphones, excuse me, their feature phones, so pre-smartphones, had quote unquote money or the access to money through their phone. That was a revolution. And this has happened in Kenya, where the population is Christian with some Muslims. It's happened in India, which is a mixed population, largely Hindu. But a lot of India is culturally not that different to Pakistan next door. I mean, there are differences, but in northern India, there's quite a lot of similarities. And there's been a huge divergence between 2011 and 2021 in these countries because of government policy and the use of digital tools and products and cheap mobile data. And yes, there's a lot of negatives. The internet has brought us, images of violence and depravity and all kinds of other things. So there are a lot of negatives the internet brings us and mental health issues the internet creates. But when it comes to financial inclusion, mobile phones and the mobile internet, when correctly used, have been a positive revolution, a real positive force for good. And I don't think we probably sufficiently around the world celebrate that. The achievement that's happened in the last 10 years, because 2011, most people in the West had a bank account. So this idea that so few people in so many countries had bank accounts in 2011 is probably not a well-known fact. So this is a really, and this is we talk about in chapter 5 and the chapter in India and chapter 6 on Pakistan. This has been a real positive in India. Still work in progress in Pakistan, sadly, but couple of friends of ours, mine, are building in the space, and we write about them in the book in chapter 6, saying good luck to them is what I say.
Now the future. So you read in crystal balls. So what are your assumptions with regard to also new technologies? I'm thinking, of course, I'm thinking of AI. I'm thinking of Web3. I'm thinking of, all those incredible new startups that we see emerging months after months. So what are your trends, the trends that you envisage, and how do you think it will reshape the entire sector?
So some of these changes are already underway. There's a famous quote from, I think it's William Gibson, that says, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And the future, in many ways, is already here when it comes to, say, the use of extended reality or immersive metaverse-like experiences, or just living in a digital world. And I always say the future is unevenly distributed by demographics and age and preferences. In the old days, like say in the 1500s or the 1600s, what would happen, or even earlier from the 1400s, if you were an adventurer from Genoa or Portugal and you wanted to discover new worlds, you'd get in a boat and you'd sail on a ship and you'd try to find India and you'd, I don't know, accidentally hit what we call America now. And if you were from China and Zhenghe, you'd set off on these massive ships, much bigger than Columbus, exploring Southeast Asia, the African coast, and you go exploring. You'd go exploring. We don't have any, at least on Earth, land left to explore. But to see the future, you don't have to get on a boat these days and go and find new lands. Look at new technologies or embrace new technologies. And the people who are doing this are typically much younger than us, because just like I said, in India or China or Africa, they didn't have a phone and they went straight from no phone to mobile phone. They leapfrogged. If you're an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, you don't go from mobile internet to the metaverse. You don't go from Web 2 to Web 3. You're in it already. You start in it. If you're in your 20s, if not older, if you're in your 20s, you still remember a age when you first got your phone, age 10 or 15, and then you began to use it, or your tablet, or if you're 8, 10, 12, you've been living in that world from year zero. You're not a tourist or a visitor to that world. I mean, people of our age, tourists in that world, people who are in their 20s or 30s, they're native to the world, but they had to like sail across the sea to get there, if you like. Whereas the generation of 12, 13 and below, they were born in that world. They didn't have to sail across any sea. They were born in that world. And the way they use technology and their lifestyles are basically, in a way, a precursor of what's going to happen to the rest of us in the next 5, 10 years. Think of Facebook. 20 years ago, Facebook was for smart college kids, right? Cool college kids. Now who uses Facebook? Our parents, right? Grandparents use Facebook. Not kids anymore. So this technology, whether it's immersive reality and then AI, and then how does it matter for money? How do you pay? How do you pay in this world? When you're playing games, you use tokens, right? You play with they're in-game tokens. So I think as the gaming world grows and grows, the role of in-game tokens will grow and grow. And that's going to be, whether it's CBDCs or stable coins or bank tokens, there's going to be a lot of token-based payments. It's one of the reasons, for example, I think PayPal rolling out a stable coin last year is for that reason. I remember when PayPal announced the stable coin, it was last summer. I was on holiday and I was in Prague, where I'm recording this from. I remember now, it's 9 months ago, I think. It's 9 months ago? Maybe even less. 6, 8 months ago. And they announced it. It was last August or something like that. What's that? Oh, that's 9 months. Yeah. And they announced a stable coin. I was thinking, why are they doing a stable coin? And I read about it and I listened to an interview with the PayPal executive in charge of the project. And he said, this is all about gaming, because gaming is going to be the next frontier. Just like e-commerce was for Web 2. In a way, e-commerce led to the growth of Web 2 fintechs. So think of the big Web 2 fintechs. So PayPal, obviously, in the US and the rest of the world, and in Asia or China, Alipay. They come out of e-commerce. They come out of Web 2 e-commerce. So the OG fintechs that we live with basically came out of e-commerce. The next generation of whatever they'll be called, fintechs or something techs, they'll come out of a mix of gaming, Web3, extended reality, metaverse. And it may well be the existing companies. It may well be the existing card companies, etc. But it could be a whole new generation of companies coming up that we just don't know about right now. But it's happening, and it's happening now. And these behavior changes over the next 3, 4, 5 years will accelerate dramatically. And it's going to be a super interesting, but also, potentially quite unnerving or scary time. Most of us, we don't always like change. And it's going to be a lot of change is happening all the time in our lives, but change is accelerating. The rate of change, the acceleration is accelerating. If you like, the second or third derivative in this case is speeding up, and that's quite a challenge to stay on top of. Maybe one last factoid before I hand it back to you is we all know the ChatGPT story, right? The 5 days. How many people signed up in 5 days, and in a month, and the speed at which ChatGPT spread was amazing, because we've had 25 years now of being used to the mobile internet and 10, 15 years of smartphones. So we're building on top of those foundations. And so, yeah, that's why everything is going to be much faster in the next few years in terms of technology. Regulation is different. Regulation and human behavior will naturally lag technology, and that gap will create tension.
But how do you see incumbent players evolving? Because we see that for now we have 10 years, if we go back 10 years ago and think of collaboration between fintech and incumbent, it was a bit the battle between the David and Goliath. Now the incumbent players have better partnerships, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but it didn't really massively change the way people interact with their banks. If I just take the example of banking. So, of course, there are some new fintech, new business models that we don't at all, and particularly our generation and even the younger generation doesn't think about. And I agree with you, but we see, if we consider the 10 last years, that it has not massively changed the entire sector. It has improved some areas, some others have not really improved. Like I'm thinking of private banking because I know it by heart. And so how do you see this? I mean, how do you see the incumbent taking those new business models, those new technologies to completely review their own business models? Or will you see it disappearing potentially longer term?
So I think you need to slice and dice financial services. You need to slice and dice financial services into these different parts. You mentioned private banking and wealth management. That's all about the personal touch. It's the same with institutional banking. If you're doing, say, investment banking, strategic advice, M&A, what are you paying for? You're paying for
the network and
paying for trusted advice, right? The network, but you're paying for the trusted advice of your advisor. If you're a private banker and his or her team, if you're an investment banker and their team aren't giving you trusted advice, then they're not doing their job, and you probably find a new advisor, whether you're in wealth or in investment banking. If you're doing other things, say you're running a consumer bank and you don't have a good app, or you don't have an app. Let's say you don't have an app. I mean, it almost sounds silly to say it, right? Because everyone has an app, because we all use mobile internet. Maybe not only mobile internet like in emerging markets, but we all use mobile internet. Most of us do. And you didn't have a good app. It took a while. There was a while. So the role of the fintechs in a way in the consumer banking space was to act as a catalyst, was to act as almost as a provocateur, to kind of, if they hadn't been there, maybe the retail banks would have been much, much slower. So they were there and they helped speed up the change in the retail banks. And it's worth remembering that this time around, it is different to previous cycles in retail and corporate banking. In the computers first arrive into banking in the US, UK, and France in the late 50s, early 60s. And the banks are amongst the early adopters of technology in that wave. The banks, I think only, like NASA, the space agency, or the Department of Defense, only the military and the space agencies were ahead of the banks. The banks are that far ahead because these are big projects. They required large investments. The banks were actually between the 60s and 80s amongst the early adopters of technology, whether it was mainframe computing or desktop computing in a way. Where the banks fell behind is in the last 10, 15 years when we went into the internet age. away from the desktop age and the mainframe age. And the internet age wasn't just about technology, which it was, but it was also about business models. And it's about a different way of doing business. And ironically, the first wave or two of technology, the mainframe age of technology, had led to banks becoming more centralized. If you're running a bank in the 1860s, in Europe, in the UK, or maybe in the British Empire, in like say HSBC or something, I don't know. It's the 1870s, 1860s. You don't have centralization. The local branch, the local Crédit Agricole entity is its own bank. And the local branch of that Crédit Agricole or wherever is its own bank. Literally every branch is like a mini bank. The branch manager is the king of that village or town, right?
That's true. That was true, yes.
Yeah. 100 years ago, even maybe 60, 70 years ago, it was the priest, the branch manager, and maybe the lawyer and the doctor. Right? Like today, like who even knows who the branch manager is?
Yes.
I mean, right? So because everything got centralized, and it got centralized in the 1980s. Not in all countries, but in many countries like the UK. In the 80s, 90s, it gets centralized in the 80s. Head office or regional offices start centralizing. So we get in the 80s and 90s, a centralization, and the internet comes along, Web 2, and the next generation, so blockchain-based technologies come along in the late 2000s and then 2010s. And these are inherently decentralizing. So Web 2 is centralizing in the sense of, there are big platform companies, but Web 2, unlike Web 1, allows user-generated content, which is into the content decentralized. We're all posting our own things on Facebook or whatever. And it gives a freedom to publish, to create to individuals. And then Web 3 gives the potential to have that decentralization and ownership. And suddenly banks are stuck in a Web 1 or a Web 0 world. And that jump is hard to make. Now, what does this all mean for money? Now, they haven't lost, as you said, huge amounts of business in, say, retail deposits or lending, but they have given up, and probably more than they would have wanted to, market share in new businesses. So the existing businesses, they lose a little bit of market share. They don't bleed market share completely. A little bit like existing deposits.
Like in drops.
Yeah, there's an existing business. But the problem the banks face is that new businesses that are being created, which they would have in the past created, or new form factors. When the ATM started in the 1960s, banks did that. When the idea of personal bank accounts grew, or mortgages, actually mortgages came in many countries outside banks. They came from mutuals and building societies, but many of the financial products came out of banks. Now the challenge is that in this new internet generation, in Web 2 and Web 3, a lot of the new companies, a lot of the new form factors like e-commerce and new business models, they were serviced by new companies. Because when e-commerce grows, PayPal grows up to service it. Alipay grows up to service it. And Sweden, Klarna, which then goes into multiple other European countries, and globally, Klarna grows up. It's not the banks. Same's happening in payments. The banks dominate B2B payments. But C2C and C2B, when I buy something or you buy something as an individual and you pay the merchant, or when you pay another individual online, oftentimes we're using fintechs or apps that are not banks. So the banks have a lock or a control over B2B. They have a lock over typically the savings and pensions of older people, but a lot of emerging products, which sometimes are very big, like I said, e-commerce or C2C or C2B or even B2C payments, those the banks don't have 100% or 95% or 90% market share, which they do in other areas of finance. And the danger here is it's very easy for a bank executive committee who are typically in their 50s, and got nothing against people in their 50s, It's a decade I've just joined. You can be in your 50s, but it's very easy to be in your 50s and say, none of this matters. It's small. As you said, it's like...
It's true. That's what I hear. That's what I hear.
And the problem is, that's fine for you. But in 10, 15 years' time, the next generation are going to come, and if they find you in your retirement village, wherever it is you're living in France or Portugal, they'll probably remind you, you left a mess for us because you retired and you didn't lose much market share, but you didn't prepare us. And there's a short-termism here, which is, and I understand that because it's all about, you've got to make your quarterly and annual profits. And if you're stock market listed, you have to think about the share price. But you're also a custodian of these businesses. You've got to think about what's going to happen in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, say payments, a lot of payments is going to be much more driven by non-B2B. And the areas that are growing are areas where you don't have a monopoly on. Or the areas that are growing are areas where you don't have a local you don't have a intuitive or native understanding of. If we see digital assets grow, digital assets, which is blockchain-based technology, is a very good example. A lot of the activity in the digital asset space, I'm talking about the regulated activity rather than the unregulated. A lot of the regulated activity is being done by asset managers, not banks, independent asset managers in the US, or by institutions like Coinbase. What they say, custody. Banks are generally very big in custody of assets, but in digital assets, it's typically all these new generation players. And, digital assets, as it grows, do you want that to be largely outside the banking industry? Or do you want banks to have a important role to play there? And that's a question for the bank management, it's a question for policymakers, regulators, etc. But the real risk is that over the next 5, 10 years, like we've seen the last 10 years, you see new areas grow of activity, economic activity, digital activity, and the banks are late in all these areas. And then the banks become complacent because they didn't lose that much deposit market share. Lose that much. But then look at lending. For decades now, we've had bond markets grow, particularly in America. And now you've seen in the last couple of years, private credit markets grow, hedge funds, alternative asset managers become an important role in the credit markets. Maybe that's peaked for this cycle, but you've seen wave after wave of new entrants basically chipping away at banks' profit pools. Money market funds in the US are like 50 years old, right? You've seen wave after wave of these new entrants come in, and each time they do, they just take another slice of the revenue pool. And investors, and this year, bank share prices in Europe are doing well, but generally for the last many years, bank share prices have not been doing very well because investors intuitively can feel it in their bones. Know this, that they don't want to buy. So most bank CEOs are sitting around going, "Oh, the market doesn't understand us." They're a little bit like, I don't know, a teenage boy wondering why the girl not dating me. It's what's wrong with it?
I see your point.
It's like she's stupid. She doesn't understand like my advantages or whatever. And the stock market, or in this case, the teenage girl can see what's wrong with the boy. That's the problem, right?
Yeah. No, but it's interesting. This is a sentiment that I have also. This is a reason why I launched the podcast 4 years ago, trying to raise awareness amongst the population of bankers and investors. The podcast is really listened by new players and not so much by incumbents. So I hope it will, increase my market share in this population will increase. What would you recommend? I mean, for all the different people with different backgrounds listening to us, if people want to be, take the pulse of all those new technologies and see the direct impact it can have even on their day-to-day, except, of course, reading your book, what else could they do?
Well, obviously, they should read my book. Well, first they should buy it on Amazon. bookshop, read it, put a good review on the website. No, just kidding. The first thing is, if you're in the space, or in any activity in the next 5 or 10 years, whether it's in finance or whichever line of white collar work, if you're in a white collar profession, is you can choose to do your existing, whatever it is, profession, activity, business, just like you're doing it now. And probably for 2 or 3 years, everything will be fine. And maybe even longer, you might bleed a bit of market share or see your TAM, total addressable market, shrink a bit, but you'll probably have a good life. And if you're just thinking about your retirement and your own career, don't do anything. Just open a bottle of wine, find a good book, go for a long walk. Have a good time. But if you do want to do this longer than for 3 or 5 years or 2 or 3 years, or you care about the people who are going to take over the business that you're running or that you're an owner of, you have to keep an open mind. It's not about learning a specific skill set or becoming an AI expert or learning about blockchain, or you have to keep an open mind. And it doesn't mean you buy everything that's sold to you. It doesn't mean that every consultant who comes and pitches you an idea or every new startup, you have to buy it. You have to be critical, but at the same time, generous and open-minded. The risk that we have, people like, me and my peers who've been in the industry, I've been in the industry almost 30 years now in financial services. You become jaded, blasé, cynical. And we associate in many cultures cynicism with intelligence. And that's fatal, because if you're cynical about everything, you'll probably not realize, but you're sitting or standing on an iceberg which is melting. And I said, this doesn't mean you have to believe everything that every snake oil merchant is selling you, because there's obviously a lot of hype and hyperbole, or vaporware as it's called in technology. But you have to keep an open mind. There are developments happening and already have happened that have fundamentally changed the way we shop, the way we live, the way we communicate. And if you don't think that's going to carry on accelerating, and that'll have an impact on the money business and the finance business, all I can say is go back to your wine and have a nice walk.
Thank you for these last words, Ronit. That was very interesting. And I'm really sad because I had in mind to co-host this discussion with a great podcaster, the founder of a podcast called Voice of FinTech, but he didn't show up. So Rudy, sorry for you. And see you soon, Ronit, and enjoy Czech Republic.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for listening and sharing this moment with us. Don't hesitate to contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn to share your comments and reactions. You can also rate this episode on your favorite podcast platform. See you soon.